Hello, my name is Ray Bowman. I've spent over 30 years in international trade. I'm a Certified Global Business Professional, or CGBP. I'm also the director of the Small Business Development Center, which is an SBA program that provides free business advising services to small and medium-sized businesses in the United States. I'm also the program chair for the Southern California District Export Council. We're appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to promote U.S. exports and international trade. I'm also a professor at Cal Lutheran as well as Santa Barbara City College, who offer degree programs in international business, certificate programs in international business and supply chain logistics. I'm also a member of several trade organizations, including the American Association of Exporters and Importers, as well as NASBITE, who's dedicated to small business international trade education. In this lesson, we're going to talk about adaptations for international trade transactions. So, if we're looking at different markets around the world and penetrating those markets, we have to realize that there are certain things that we have to adapt to that may not be the same as our home markets, our domestic markets. I divide these four things, these adaptations, into four different areas. The first area of culture and language, country laws, climate and geography, as well as governments, and how they execute the law. So first, let's look at cultural considerations. It's very important to realize that your product, your marketing, your target markets have to consider cultural differences. There's a lot of different resources for looking at cultural differences, but to me, one of the most important things is not only looking at how another culture is different, but how that culture is different from your culture and how that other culture may perceive yours. So one of the most effective tools in looking at culture from both sides is Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Hofstede, a professor, divided cultural considerations or differences into 5 different areas. The first area is power distance. Power distance is basically the extent to which a culture feels that they have any influence and say into government matters. How much does government influence them or they influence government? Individualism. Individualism is important because some countries have a greater importance on the individual than others. Others are more collective. For example, the U.S. is often considered very high in terms of individualism. We tend to set goals, we tend to praise individual achievement, whereas other countries, a lot of Asian countries, for example, may look at decisions and achievements in terms of the collective, in terms of the group, rather than the individual. Masculinity. Some cultures have more of a masculine component than others, and you have to understand what some of those differences are in order to adapt your product and your markets. Uncertainty avoidance. What that is the extent to which a culture can adapt to rapid change in a market. Some cultures don't like change as much as others, or don't adapt to it as much as others. The other thing is long-term orientation. Is the culture you're dealing with very long-term in its planning, long-term in its goaling, or is it very short-term? Oftentimes, U.S. companies are considered to be very short-term because we tend to goal to the month, the quarter, and really not go out to 5 years, decade-long strategies. And there's a lot of countries that do that. So it's important. These are important aspects to consider when you're negotiating, and they're also important to consider as far as expectation, in the negotiating process. The next area is buying and selling habits. Consumers are different in different markets, and it's important to realize that they're different and try to understand what those differences are. Some have a different value orientation. In other words, in a market that has a lot of disposable income, the consumers may be less concerned with quality. They may make more impulse buys, whereas a culture with limited disposable income may think a lot more carefully about the value of what they're buying, think a lot harder about the quality and what they're getting, because they know that they want to have to rebuy the item. Commercial guides can be very effective. So as much as there's a lot of information that can be purchased, at the same time, a lot of countries, U.S. Commercial Service, for example, puts out a lot of good commercial guides to looking at buying and consumer habits within different types of industries. So that's important consideration. Language is also a very important consideration. Not only translating the language, but making sure that within your advertising, your video, your web design, that the language is not using slang that may not translate properly, that the jargon you're using is specific to that industry, and you've adapted that way, making sure that that the translation flows the right way. You may have some marketing translated in a certain language, but different language may have different dialects. Just as English, there's different shades and cultural changes that happen within the English language, from, let's say, the U.S. as opposed to Australia as opposed to the United Kingdom. So it's very important to realize that just translating is not enough, that the jargon has to be correct. If you're using slang, that it's the correct slang for that target market. Product packaging is another important area. Any one of us who has bought an item that we have to put together, you may notice that a lot of these manuals are in multiple languages. Well, there's so much cost in order to do that. Companies try to make sure that their inventory is as global as possible, so that they can move inventory according to demand rather than according to how the manuals within that product were set up. Labeling as well is very important. Negotiations. It's very important that we understand that the language that we use within international agreements is very important. How we conduct meetings. Do we need facilitation in terms of language for these meetings? Is that facilitation, is that translation going to be the right kinds of translation to make sure that it not only recognizes the language, but it recognizes our industry jargon? So that's very important. Climate. We don't often think of climate as affecting an international trade transaction, but it affects it in several ways. First of all is logistics. Any one of us who have taken a plane flight and had it delayed because of some problem with weather understand what probably just happened with the cargo in the cargo hold of that plane. Same things happened. So it's good to understand that in the supply chain, if you're shipping all year round, there's going to be things that you have to adapt to that are related to the climate and how that affects your supply chain. Seasonality of merchandise. A good example is swimwear. If you're in the swimwear business, you're going to be selling, or the peak of your sales is going to be following warm weather, spring and summer, for whatever that market is. At the same time, there are other types of products that it's less obvious. I'll give you an example. I had a client who was doing aftermarket auto parts in Canada. Well, as it turns out, aftermarket automotive parts, the consumers like to work on their cars during spring and summer, avoiding the cold of winter. So it wasn't so much that the product itself needed to adapt, but we had to adapt in terms of climate for the consumer that was buying it. Product availability. I get this a lot working with agricultural companies. A lot of agricultural product companies, whether you're doing lemons or whatever kind of produce, even wine, you may have to adapt your worldwide inventory to make sure you're servicing your customers all year round by looking at the availability from one market to the next based on climate. The other adaptation is geography. Geography can very much affect logistics. Right? Is the factory that you're buying from in a remote location, or the customer that you're shipping to? That affects the supply chain. It also affects your costs to a large extent. I remember having clients who were selling things like solar generators, and they were selling them to some very remote areas, such that oftentimes the price and cost of the logistics exceeded or equaled the cost of the product. Economic clusters. A lot of industries tend to cluster so that you have a main product that may be supported by 10 other different types of company, and those form economic clusters. And those clusters very much form around geographical patterns. Consumer habits. Consumer habits can often be colored by challenges in geography. Where is the customer located? How often do they get deliveries for certain items? Do they run shortages because of their location? So these are all things that are very important to consider. Laws of governments. It's very important that wherever you're transacting international business, that you understand that there's all kinds of laws within that country that you have to consider, as well as your own country. We often, or a lot of exporters I deal with, will often dismiss laws in other countries because they assume that will be taken care of by their buyer. But if you're going to find that buyer in the first place, you really have to do your homework on what some of the legal regulatory considerations are going to be. Things such as what the duty rates, what are the duties and taxes within that foreign country? How do treaties affect your product? To the advantage of your product or to the disadvantage. You may be overlooking a country that has some wonderful foreign trade agreements in favor of a country that you're used to that may not have the same type of advantages. This happens all the time with regards to China. I know many countries that will trade with China, which is very difficult to deal with because of lack of trade agreements, and ignore countries like Korea, where we do have very effective trade agreements. So it's very important to realize, the effects and the advantages of those agreements. Understanding customs. In different countries, customs, laws, and policies may look and act very differently. So it's important to understand that. Labor unions. This may affect not only the delivery of your product, but the servicing of your product. So it's very important to know how unions affect your product in different international markets, as well as other government regulations. Different products may have a whole myriad of different regulations associated with them. You may have products that have to do with consumer safety, or you may have government regulations that affect the quality of the product or the origin of the product, or affect emissions, or affect electrical signals. So there's all kinds of different government schemes or regulations that you have to be aware of and do your homework based on what those areas are. The next thing that's important is you may do your homework in terms of government regulations, but you also have to be conscious of how those governments enforce and apply those particular regulations. So you may have countries that may be very tough on enforcement or very lax on enforcement. They may change the way they interpret the law. So from one area of the country to the next, the interpretation of certain laws may be different. You may encounter facilitation fees. In some countries, that government official, that customs official, or the person working for that agency may not be working for a salary, but may be working for a facilitation. So you have to be aware of that. Local governments may affect your product internationally, so you have to be aware of some of those things that that can affect your product. Home country intervention. Some countries can be very protective of certain industries, and you have to be aware of that climate. For this reason, a lot of importers and exporters will test the market. Instead of doing a large transaction for their first, they may break up the transaction, or they may do test transactions just to see how the government is actually going to execute on the laws that you've studied. So a very good a good best practice in this area is to do test shipments within a certain market to make sure that your assumptions on what you have to adapt to are correct and you haven't missed anything. So I hope this information is valuable to you, and talk to you later on the next lesson.